Most people eventually stop waiting. That is what everyone in Harbor Point, Maine believed. Yet for more than 1,000 days, an aging golden dog named Rusty proved them wrong. Every afternoon, no matter how cold the wind blew in from the Atlantic or how heavy the snow fell across the harbor, he made the same journey. At exactly 4:17 p.m., Rusty would leave the weathered porch of the small cottage where he lived and slowly make his way toward the old train station near the waterfront. The townspeople knew his routine so well that many of them checked their watches when they saw him pass. Children waved to him. Shop owners greeted him by name. Visitors often stopped to take pictures. But there was nothing ordinary about what Rusty was doing. He was waiting for someone who had never returned. The train whistle echoed through the crisp afternoon air as another passenger train rolled into the station. Rusty was already there, sitting beside a faded wooden bench at the far end of the platform. His golden coat had grown lighter with age, and the gray around his muzzle seemed to grow a little more every winter. Still, his eyes remained fixed on the train doors. One by one, passengers stepped onto the platform carrying suitcases, backpacks, and shopping bags. Rusty watched every face. He always watched every face. For a moment, hope seemed to flicker inside him. Then the crowd thinned. The conductor called out a final announcement. The doors closed. Moments later, the train pulled away, disappearing around the bend beyond the harbor. Rusty did not move right away. He simply stared at the empty tracks, as if expecting one last passenger to appear. Eventually, he lowered his head and slowly rose to his feet. The disappointment never seemed to stop him from returning the next day. Across the street, a group of schoolchildren stood with their teacher, Margaret Collins. They had just finished an after-school reading program at the local library. One little boy tugged gently on Margaret's sleeve. "Why does he keep coming back?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked toward Rusty and smiled sadly. "Because he loves someone," she replied. The boy frowned. "But everyone says that person is gone." Margaret glanced toward the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. "Sometimes," she said, "love doesn't listen to what everyone else believes." The child followed Rusty with his eyes as the old dog disappeared down the sidewalk toward the waterfront. The answer seemed to raise even more questions. Around Harbor Point, everyone knew the story. Everyone knew about the fisherman who vanished years ago. Everyone knew about the faithful dog who never gave up. What nobody knew was that far beyond the horizon, beyond the shipping lanes and beyond the storms that swept across the Atlantic, the story was not over. Not even close. And on this particular afternoon, as Rusty settled beneath the fading sunlight and waited for another tomorrow, fate was already beginning to move in a direction that would change both of their lives forever. Long before Harbor Point knew Rusty as the dog who waited at the train station, he belonged to a fisherman named Ethan Brooks. Ethan lived alone in a modest cedar-shingled cottage overlooking the harbor. The house was small, but it offered a clear view of the ocean he loved. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan would step onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee while Rusty sat beside him watching the first light spread across the water. The two of them had shared that routine for nearly 10 years. People in town often joked that where one could be found, the other was never far away. Ethan was not a wealthy man, but he was respected throughout the community. He fixed neighbors' docks when storms damaged them. He helped stranded boaters return safely to shore. He remembered birthdays, checked on elderly residents during winter storms, and never seemed too busy to lend a hand. Rusty followed him everywhere, from the bait shop near Main Street to the crowded docks where fishing boats lined the harbor. Around his neck hung a small brass compass that Ethan had discovered years earlier during a trip off the New England coast. The compass no longer worked properly, but Ethan treasured it anyway. Whenever someone asked why he kept it on Rusty's collar, he always smiled and said, "Every sailor needs something to guide him home." The phrase became familiar around town. Children repeated it. Fishermen laughed about it. Even Rusty seemed to recognize the words. On quiet evenings, Ethan and Rusty often sat together on an old wooden bench near the waterfront. They would watch the sunset paint the sky shades of orange and gold while seabirds drifted above the waves. Ethan usually spoke aloud, even when nobody else was around. He told Rusty about the weather, the fishing conditions, and the stories he heard from other captains. Sometimes he spoke about dreams he never pursued. Other times he simply sat in comfortable silence. For Ethan, Companionship did not require conversation. It only required presence. One autumn afternoon, Margaret Collins happened to pass by the harbor and noticed Ethan scratching behind Rusty's ears. She smiled and waved. Ethan greeted her warmly. As they spoke, Margaret asked whether he ever worried about spending so much time out on the water alone. Ethan glanced toward Rusty before answering. "I am never really alone," he said. Rusty's tail immediately began wagging, causing both adults to laugh. Looking back years later, Margaret would remember that moment with surprising clarity. She would remember the sunlight reflecting off the harbor. She would remember Rusty's happy expression. Most of all, she would remember how impossible it seemed that anything could ever separate the two. Yet life often changes when people least expect it. As winter approached, weather forecasts began warning of stronger storms moving across the Atlantic. Most fishermen paid attention but continued their routines. Ethan was no different. Fishing was not simply his job. It was the life he understood. And one cold December morning, before the town had fully awakened, Ethan prepared for what everyone believed would be another ordinary trip out to sea. The morning Ethan left Harbor Point, the harbor was wrapped in a thin layer of fog. The docks creaked softly beneath his boots as he loaded supplies onto his fishing boat. Rusty followed closely behind, just as he always did. The old dog watched every movement with careful attention, his tail swaying slowly as if he expected another ordinary day. Ethan paused beside the boat and knelt to scratch behind Rusty's ears. "I will be back before you know it, buddy," he said with a smile. Rusty responded by placing one paw gently against Ethan's leg. Several fishermen preparing their own boats waved as Ethan pushed away from the dock. Nobody thought anything unusual about the departure. Winter fishing trips were common in Harbor Point. The weather forecast mentioned rough conditions farther offshore, but experienced captains like Ethan had navigated difficult seas many times before. As the boat disappeared into the gray horizon, Rusty remained on the dock longer than usual. He sat quietly beside a stack of lobster traps, staring toward the open water until the vessel could no longer be seen. The first day passed without concern. The second day brought stronger winds. By the third day, conversations throughout Harbor Point began to change. Boats returning from offshore reported worsening conditions across parts of the Atlantic. Harbor masters checked radio reports more frequently. Families watched weather updates with growing unease. Margaret Collins noticed small groups gathering near the marina, speaking in lowered voices. Then came the news nobody wanted to hear. Ethan's boat had failed to report its position. Calls received no response. Search teams were organized. Aircraft surveyed large sections of ocean. Rescue vessels followed every possible lead. For days, the entire community held on to hope. People brought food to the harbor workers. Churches opened their doors for prayer services. Fishermen volunteered additional time to assist the search effort. Through it all, Rusty stayed near the waterfront. Whenever a rescue boat returned, he would stand and watch. Whenever a vehicle pulled into the marina, his ears would perk up. It was as though he believed Ethan could appear at any moment. Weeks passed. Eventually, the search was scaled back. Officials explained that every available resource had been used. The ocean had offered very few answers. Harbor Point struggled to accept what that might mean. A memorial gathering was held near the shoreline one cold afternoon. Friends shared stories about Ethan's kindness and generosity. People laughed through tears while remembering his favorite jokes and his habit of helping strangers without expecting anything in return. Margaret stood among the crowd, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. Rusty sat quietly beside the empty bench where Ethan had once watched sunsets over the harbor. Many people assumed the dog could not understand what was happening. Yet when the gathering ended and everyone slowly walked away, Rusty remained where he was. As darkness settled over the water, he continued staring toward the horizon. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Instead of returning to the harbor, Rusty walked across town to the train station. He sat beside a weathered wooden bench near the platform and waited. Nobody knew why he chose that place. Nobody understood what he expected to find there. But when the afternoon train arrived, Rusty watched every passenger step onto the platform as though searching for one familiar face. While Harbor Point slowly adjusted to life without Ethan, the truth was unfolding hundreds of miles away where nobody could see it. Ethan opened his eyes beneath a sky he did not recognize. The last thing he remembered clearly was fighting exhaustion during a powerful storm. Now he found himself lying on a narrow stretch of sand surrounded by unfamiliar shoreline. Palm-sized shells littered the beach. Waves rolled gently onto the sand as though nothing unusual had happened. For several minutes, he simply stared upward, trying to understand where he was. When he finally stood, his legs felt weak and unsteady. The island was small. A rocky ridge rose from its center, surrounded by clusters of wind-shaped trees and patches of thick vegetation. There were no buildings, no boats, no signs of other people, only the endless blue horizon stretching in every direction. During the first few days, Ethan focused on basic survival. He explored the island carefully, searching for fresh water and anything useful that had washed ashore. Driftwood collected along parts of the beach. Fragments of rope appeared tangled among seaweed. Rainwater gathered naturally in shallow depressions between rocks after passing storms. Every discovery felt important. Every small success bought him another day. At night, however, survival became more difficult in a different way. The silence was overwhelming. Ethan had spent most of his life around the sounds of people, fishing boats, harbor traffic, and Rusty's familiar footsteps following close behind. Now the only sounds were wind, waves, and distant seabirds. The loneliness settled over him like a heavy blanket. One evening, while organizing the few belongings he had managed to save, Ethan reached into a jacket pocket and discovered something unexpected. His hand closed around a familiar piece of worn leather. Slowly, he pulled out Rusty's spare collar. Years earlier, he had carried it during longer fishing trips as a backup. Somehow it had remained with him through everything. Ethan sat quietly on the sand, holding the collar for a long time. For the first time since arriving on the island, emotion broke through the determination that had carried him forward. He thought about Harbor Point. He thought about the cottage overlooking the harbor. Most of all, he thought about Rusty waiting by the front door whenever he returned home. "I am coming back," he whispered into the fading light. "Just wait for me." From that night forward, the collar became his greatest source of strength. Every evening, he placed it beside him before sleeping. Every morning it reminded him why giving up was not an option. Weeks turned into months. Ethan built a small shelter using driftwood and branches. He improved it little by little until it offered protection from rain and ocean winds. He learned the rhythms of the island. Yet despite all his progress, one question remained unanswered. How long could he continue surviving before someone finally noticed he was there? One morning, standing atop the highest rocky point on the island, Ethan looked across the endless ocean and made a decision. If nobody was coming to find him, he would find a way to be seen. From that day forward, Ethan devoted himself to creating a signal that could be seen from far beyond the island. He gathered pale stones from every corner of the shoreline and carried them one by one to a wide stretch of beach visible from the air. The work was exhausting. Some days the sun beat down relentlessly. Other days strong winds scattered his progress and forced him to begin again. Yet every morning he returned to the same task. Slowly, a giant compass shape emerged across the sand. At its center, Ethan arranged the stones to form a single word that mattered more than anything else in his life. Rusty. Whenever he looked down from the rocky ridge above the beach, the name reminded him why he had to keep going. Back in Harbor Point, life moved forward even as Rusty's routine never changed. Weeks became months. Then months became years. Tourists who visited during the summer often stopped to ask about the dog sitting quietly at the train station. Local residents told the story so many times that it became part of the town's identity. Rusty listened to none of it. Every afternoon he appeared beside the same weathered bench and watched the arriving passengers. At first, many people expected the habit to fade. They assumed time would eventually heal whatever loss he felt. Instead, the opposite happened. The waiting became part of who he was. Margaret Collins found herself thinking about him more often than she expected. What began as occasional concern gradually turned into daily responsibility. During cold weather, she brought blankets. During rainy afternoons, she carried an umbrella and stood nearby while Rusty watched the trains arrive. She never tried to stop him from waiting. Somehow she sensed that doing so would feel like asking him to abandon hope itself. The children at her school soon became involved as well. They saved portions of their lunches. They drew pictures of Rusty during art class. One student even wrote an essay describing him as the most loyal resident in Harbor Point. The essay was later displayed in the library window. Rusty never noticed the attention. He cared only about the train doors opening and the possibility that one familiar figure might step onto the platform. Meanwhile, on the island, Ethan's determination continued to shape every day. In addition to the giant compass, he maintained a signal fire on the highest point overlooking the ocean. Each morning, he collected driftwood. Each evening, he checked the fire carefully before darkness settled across the water. Ships occasionally appeared far on the horizon. Whenever that happened, Ethan waved, shouted, and added fresh fuel to the flames. None came close enough to notice. Still, he refused to quit. The collar remained beside him every night. It had become more than a memory. It was a promise. Then, nearly 3 years after arriving on the island, Ethan noticed changes within himself that worried him. The loneliness felt heavier. The days felt longer. For the first time, he wondered whether hope could last forever. And far away in Harbor Point, age was beginning to catch up with Rusty as well. Rusty's muzzle had become almost completely gray by the beginning of the third winter. The walk from the harbor to the train station now took longer than it once had. Some afternoons he paused several times along the sidewalk to rest before continuing toward the platform. Yet no matter how tired he appeared, he never missed the arrival of the afternoon train. The people of Harbor Point noticed every change. Shop owners quietly left bowls of water outside their stores. Fishermen greeted him gently as he passed. Children no longer ran toward him excitedly. Instead, they walked beside him at his pace. Margaret worried the most. She could see that age was slowly stealing Rusty's strength. One snowy afternoon, she brought him to the local veterinarian for a routine examination. The doctor was kind and patient. After finishing the checkup, he sat quietly for a moment before speaking. Rusty was healthy for his age, but he was no longer a young dog. The years were catching up with him. Margaret thanked the veterinarian and drove home in silence. That evening she sat beside Rusty on the porch of her small house. Snowflakes drifted through the glow of the porch light while the old dog rested his head on her knee. Margaret found herself wondering whether Ethan had ever imagined that so many people would come to care about his companion. The next day, she shared the veterinarian's concerns with a few close friends. Word spread quickly through town. Soon everyone seemed to be discussing the same thing. Nobody wanted Rusty to face his final years alone. Without planning it formally, the community began changing its routine. Every afternoon, someone joined Rusty at the train station. Sometimes it was a retired fisherman carrying a folding chair. Sometimes it was a family with children bundled in winter coats. Sometimes it was Margaret herself reading a book while sitting quietly beside him. What mattered was that the bench was rarely empty anymore. Rusty still watched the arriving passengers, but now he did so surrounded by people who had become part of his journey. Meanwhile, far beyond the Atlantic shipping routes, Ethan faced his own difficult season. A powerful storm swept across the island with relentless force. For hours he sheltered among rocks while wind and rain transformed the landscape around him. When the storm finally passed, much of what he had built over the years had been damaged. Sections of his shelter were gone. Supplies had been scattered. Most devastating of all, his signal fire had been extinguished. Ethan stood on the ridge overlooking the ocean and felt something inside him begin to weaken. For nearly 3 years, he had fought every day to stay hopeful. Now the horizon looked larger and emptier than ever. Days passed. He repaired little. He spoke little. For the first time since arriving on the island, he allowed himself to imagine that perhaps nobody would ever find him. Then one evening, he reached for the worn collar resting beside him. As he held it in both hands, memories returned with surprising clarity. He pictured Rusty waiting by the front door. He pictured the harbor at sunset. He pictured a faithful dog refusing to give up. And suddenly Ethan realized that somewhere, whether he knew it or not, Rusty was probably still waiting. The realization changed everything. The following morning, Ethan climbed to the highest point on the island before sunrise. The ocean stretched endlessly around him, glowing silver beneath the early light. For several minutes, he stood silently, holding Rusty's collar in one hand. Then he began working again. He rebuilt the signal fire larger than before. He gathered driftwood from distant parts of the shoreline. He carried heavy branches across the island. He cleared rocks and debris from the ridge. By the end of the day, smoke once again rose into the sky. The work continued every day afterward. Whenever exhaustion threatened to slow him down, Ethan thought about Harbor Point. He imagined familiar streets. He imagined the harbor at sunset. Most of all, he imagined an old golden dog still waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Those images became stronger than doubt. Back in town, another winter was gradually giving way to spring. The snowbanks shrank. The harbor ice disappeared. Seagulls returned in larger numbers, circling above the fishing boats that once again filled the waterfront. Yet despite the changing season, Rusty's routine remained unchanged. Every afternoon he appeared beside the weathered bench at the train station. The years had taken much of his strength, but not his determination. One afternoon, Margaret arrived carrying a folded blanket and found several people already gathered around the platform. A retired fisherman sat drinking coffee from a thermos. Two schoolchildren were reading books nearby. A local bakery owner had brought fresh treats for everyone. Nobody had organized the gathering. It simply happened. Harbor Point had quietly adopted Rusty's mission as its own. As the train arrived and passengers stepped onto the platform, everyone found themselves watching alongside him. When the final passenger disappeared and the train pulled away, nobody spoke for a moment. They all understood the disappointment Rusty never seemed willing to acknowledge. A few days later, someone placed a small wooden sign beside the bench. The words were simple: "No soul is left behind." Margaret recognized the phrase immediately. Ethan had spoken it countless times over the years. Soon flowers appeared beside the sign. Then photographs. Visitors stopped to read the message and ask about its meaning. Before long, the bench became more than a place where a dog waited. It became a symbol of hope for the entire town. Far away across the Atlantic, 11 days passed after Ethan rebuilt. The signal fire. Each morning, he checked the horizon. Each evening, he added fresh wood to keep the smoke visible. Nothing happened. Then, just after noon on a clear spring day, he noticed something unusual. A vessel was moving in the distance. At first, it appeared no different from countless ships he had seen before. Yet this one seemed closer. Ethan added more fuel to the fire. Thick smoke climbed into the sky. Minutes felt like hours. The vessel continued forward. Then it changed direction slightly. Ethan stared in disbelief. For nearly 3 years he had dreamed about this moment. He did not allow himself to celebrate yet. He had experienced disappointment too many times before. But as the ship gradually moved closer, one impossible thought finally entered his mind. Someone had seen the signal. Someone was coming. And thousands of miles away, Rusty was preparing for another afternoon at the train station, completely unaware that everything was about to change. The vessel turned out to be an oceanographic research ship conducting environmental studies across a remote section of the Atlantic. Members of the crew had noticed the unusual column of smoke rising from the island and decided to investigate. As the ship drew closer, Ethan stood on the shoreline, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. For years he had imagined rescue. Now it was unfolding before his eyes. When the crew finally reached the beach, they were astonished to find a man who had survived alone for so long through determination, ingenuity, and an unwillingness to surrender hope. Ethan's first questions were not about himself. He wanted to know the date. He wanted to know how much time had passed. And more than anything else, he wanted to know whether Harbor Point still existed exactly as he remembered it. During the weeks that followed, Ethan received medical care and assistance while authorities worked through the complicated process of confirming his identity and arranging his return home. News of his survival spread gradually through official channels, but Harbor Point remained unaware. The distance between the island and Maine was still measured in thousands of miles, and preparations took time. Meanwhile, spring sunshine returned to the town. Flowers appeared in window boxes along Main Street. Boats filled the harbor once again. Every afternoon, Rusty continued his familiar journey to the station. His steps had become slower than ever. Some days Margaret worried he might not have the strength to make the walk much longer. Yet the moment he saw the platform, something seemed to awaken inside him. He would lift his head, straighten his posture, and stare toward the tracks with the same quiet expectation he had carried for nearly 3 years. One afternoon, as residents gathered around the bench, a conversation spread through the crowd. Someone had heard rumors from outside the state. Someone else mentioned an unusual report involving a man found on a remote island. No one paid much attention at first. Stories traveled strangely through coastal communities. Most turned out to be misunderstandings. Still, Margaret noticed herself thinking about the rumors later that evening. She glanced toward Rusty sleeping peacefully beside the fireplace and wondered what she would say if the impossible ever happened. Days later, while Ethan completed the final arrangements for his journey home, Harbor Point prepared for another ordinary afternoon. Children left school. Shopkeepers greeted customers. Fishermen unloaded their catches at the docks. At 4 o'clock, Rusty began walking toward the station. By then, several residents had already gathered around the familiar bench. The wooden sign remained in place beside fresh flowers. No soul is left behind. The words had weathered countless storms, just as Rusty had. At exactly the same moment, hundreds of miles away, Ethan boarded a train that would carry him north toward the town he had never stopped believing he would see again. In his travel bag rested the worn leather collar that had helped keep him alive. As the train rolled forward, Ethan stared out the window and whispered a single name. Rusty. Neither of them knew it yet, but the waiting was almost over. The afternoon train arrived beneath a sky painted with the soft colors of early spring. A gentle breeze drifted in from the harbor, carrying the scent of salt water through the station. As usual, Rusty lay on the blanket Margaret had placed beside the old bench. Around him sat many of the people who had become part of his daily ritual. Some were reading. Some were talking quietly. Others simply watched the tracks with him. When the distant whistle echoed through town, nobody expected this day to be different from the hundreds that had come before it. The train slowed as it entered the station. Its wheels rolled steadily along the rails before finally coming to a stop. The doors opened. Passengers began stepping onto the platform carrying luggage, briefcases, and shopping bags. Rusty lifted his head and watched. He always watched. One by one the passengers passed. Then a tall figure appeared in the doorway of one of the train cars. The man moved slowly. His hair had become gray. His face carried the marks of years spent under sun and wind. In one hand, he held a worn travel bag. In the other, he carried something made of old leather. For a moment, nobody reacted. The platform seemed frozen in silence. Rusty's ears suddenly lifted. His tired eyes focused on the stranger. The man took another step forward and stopped. Tears filled his eyes. Then he spoke a single word. Rusty. The old dog remained motionless for a heartbeat. Then another. Something changed in his expression. His tail began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. He struggled to stand. Margaret reached toward him instinctively, worried he might fall, but Rusty had already started forward. The years seemed to disappear as he crossed the platform. People stepped aside. Some covered their mouths. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The man dropped his bag and knelt down. Rusty reached him and pressed his head against the familiar chest he had spent nearly 3 years searching for. Ethan wrapped both arms around his loyal companion and held him close. Neither seemed willing to let go. Around them, the station had become completely silent except for the distant cries of seagulls drifting in from the harbor. Many people openly cried. Others simply stood in disbelief. The story they had carried in their hearts for years had finally reached its ending. Or perhaps its beginning. In the months that followed, Ethan slowly rebuilt his life in Harbor Point. He spent countless hours sharing stories with neighbors and thanking the people who had cared for Rusty when he could not. Eventually, Ethan and Margaret transformed the old station building into a small cafe overlooking the harbor. They named it Homeward Harbor Cafe. Above the main fireplace hung the brass compass that had once rested on Rusty's collar. Visitors often asked about its meaning. Ethan always smiled before answering. Each evening, as the sun settled beyond the Atlantic and golden light filled the room, Rusty rested beneath the same old bench that had become famous throughout town. Before locking the doors each night, Ethan would kneel beside him, place a gentle hand on his head, and repeat the words that had carried them both through years of separation. No soul is left behind. And somehow, looking out across the peaceful harbor, everyone who heard those words believed them.